So let me introduce to you today our program. So lapped on one side by the Atlantic Ocean, the other by the Gulf of Mexico, ours is a state afloat in both seas. A peninsula of almost, get ready for these facts, 2,208 miles of tidal shorelines, 11,000 miles of rivers, 700 freshwater springs, and some 7,700 lakes. Our Florida story is written in water, but the next chapter remains unwritten. We know of historic Kissington Spring in Polk County, but have also seen the great success of Environmental Lands Program to acquire and preserve endangered and environmentally sensitive lands, water resources, and important wildlife habitats. Circle B, Crooked Lake Prairie, the Peace River Hammock, and Gator Creek Reserve, to name a few, are all lands where we see the profound influence of water on the natural landscape. How do we continue to protect these fluid landscapes? Pivoting from the efforts of agencies and governments to preserve the landscape, today's presenter introduces us to a reimagined relationship with water, one that views both humanity and water as equal parts of the natural world. And I know you may be raising an eyebrow or two, but consider that this tradition in Florida has been observed by Seminole and indigenous groups since long before our time. Dr. Victoria Machado received her BA and MA at the University of Florida, focusing on intentional communities, sustainability, and bioregionalism. After working as an environmental organizer in South Florida, she returned to the University of Florida, where she studied the intersection of religion and environmental activism. Please join me as we welcome Dr. Victoria Machado.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here. What a lovely community you all have, and just some of the conversations that I had before makes me really hopeful that this will be well received. So I want to give a special thank you to the Polk County History Center here and the Florida Humanities for sponsoring the program. I also want to give a huge thank you to Jamie Jameson for connecting with me and organizing this event. And today we are going to be talking about spirituality and Florida's sacred waters and what this means within the context of environmental protection. So I am going to share with you a story about water, but more importantly, it's about a story about our relationship with Florida's water. It's important to keep the term relationship in mind because this story is not just about the water, it's also about us too, and how we might reimagine this resource when we are looking at it within the lens of the sacred. And I'm really grateful for that wonderful introduction. Sometimes people don't know that I spent my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD studying religious studies. And to give you a little bit of context, for 15 years, I have focused on understanding the beliefs and practices that we all love, and sometimes that we love to hate so much. Religion has a lot of mixed feelings sometimes. My studies have focused largely on socio-cultural perspectives. And while I've taught classes on traditional, more mainstream world religions, like Christianity and Judaism and Islam, my specialized field is religion and nature. So today we are going to be talking about the spiritual within the environment. And in some cases, this means viewing the environment as sacred. And in other cases, this just means shifting our perspectives to further highlight the importance of our environment. And we'll explore both examples today. So religion and nature covers a range of topics, while spirituality, particularly within the context of nature, is known for sometimes being unruly. There are several scholars who have successfully grounded it. And broadly, thinking about the definition of nature religion, it's an expression for all religious phenomenon in which nature is an important religious symbol or conceptual resource, whether or not nature is considered sacred. And it's important for me to explain this definition a little bit before we start, because oftentimes people will see my presentation and they'll think, well, those are resources to be managed and to be used or to be dominated, and in some traditions that might be the case. But if we're looking at nature as important, that's another lens of looking at things, right? So the important thing to keep in mind for this talk is that we all have underlying beliefs, and these beliefs shape the stories that we tell and the ways that we interact with the world. They shape our outlooks. We also have collectively held beliefs that are reinforced through our communities and societies. We have attributed certain signs and symbols to specific meanings. These are views that we share. Red meaning stop, green meaning go, right? Probably not great to pet a gator. These are some things that we have decided collectively. And there are signs and symbols that are also contested. Stopping to relax or take caution when wading into uncertain waters, right? Today, I would like us to think about how our environment shapes us and how nature can be an important religious symbol or conceptual resource within the stories and beliefs that we share. So I would like to start today's talk with some participant engagement. I'm really excited to see so many great faces out here today. How long have you lived in Florida? If you just want to raise your hand or just shout it out, go for it.
20 years.
20 years, okay, in the back.
81 years.
81 years, great.
60 years.
60 years?
60.
60?
Preston.
75.
75.
3.5.
3.5, 3.5, okay. And it helps me to kind of gauge, how much people know about an area sometimes. And so if you have been here for a very long time, as many of you have, or if you are fairly new to the area, wherever you situate yourself, we are all living here in Florida, and hopefully these maps are not new to anyone. And I would like us to take a moment to analyze them and to look at what they show and what they represent and what they're conveying. So to put this in context, I spent years teaching writing, and in my classes, I ask students to stop and read images as a text. So we're going to do just that. We are going to do rather a superficial read, then we're going to do a deeper read. But what I want us to think about is, what are these maps showing us? And this, you can shout this out too. I'll repeat it for those who are watching later.
Florida is fun.
Okay, Florida is fun. What is this map showing?
Transportation.
Transportation, right? It's got a lot of roads, right? What about this one? Mickey Mouse, tourism. We've got a space shuttle, right? And if this one, what are we seeing here?
Counties.
We've got counties, right? Now I want us to think about what these maps are telling us, right? And you kind of already jumped the gun on this one because you already said transportation, right? It shows transportation. So lots of roads show transportation. It says something about how we are getting around, how we're moving around. We've got attractions. We've got Mickey Mouse. It's showing tourism. And we've got counties, which is showing our political boundaries. Self-governing areas that make up this large state. And from these vantage points, our state is covered with roads, it's peppered with attractions. In many cases, straight lines dictate our boundaries. But for those of us who know the land, sometimes by years of living here, right? Maybe 81 years of living here, or maybe 3.5 years of living here, we know the land by maybe in-depth exploration. There's a knowledge of high ground. There's a knowledge of temperatures other than hot. There's a knowledge of trees other than palm, right? We know which areas flood and which areas do not. And we know that our seasons are not necessarily dictated by snow, right? Like there's something to be said about our seasons that are often dictated by rain. And this is important to keep in mind as we're thinking about our state. This is Johnny Dame. He's an artist. He's painted this stunning topographical map of the north central Florida region. And here's just a little bit closer view of this map. And in this map, rivers are given depth, and their floodplains can be identified by low-lying regions. And such a representation moves them beyond the static spaces into a natural rhythm that is known mostly by those who know the land. And the interesting point here is the story that accompanies this image. The image both shows and tells us the place that we all know, but with a different lens. So if you'll notice, none of the maps on the previous slide, if we were to go back to here, they are not telling us about rivers. They are not necessarily, well, some of them are, right? Okay, so I can't say that. But they're not necessarily telling us about flood basins or floodplains or river basins. And the other thing is that they're missing topography. They're missing, in a lot of ways, they're also missing us. They're missing depth, they're missing water, they're missing people, and they are setting the stage for the stories that we tell about how and where we live, right? So I want us to think about that as we continue on. So we have tons of stories about interacting in the natural world, but what happens when we stop and we think about our places as instead of settings, if we start thinking about them as main characters, these driving forces that dictate how we live and maybe also who we are. So how would the story change? Rather than water being a place that you go to or a resource that you use, what happens when we view water as an entity that you know? So this afternoon, the story is going to be about a passive nature. This is going to be a story about an active character that is important to each of us, one that we are in relationship with through the mere fact that we rely on it every single day to live. This is a story about a character with a voice that must be considered if we are to continue living in this place we call Florida, one that is representative of the sacred. And similar to the images, we will read into the underlying ideas that arise when we look at our collective relationship with our surroundings and when we explore human-nature interactions. So for years, we've carried this role as the Sunshine State. But what do you see when you look at this map, this satellite image? We're surrounded by water, right? A lot of my questions were very, we're going for the low, right? I talked to a lot of different crowds, so you all are way beyond, light years beyond a lot of folks who kind of come in and really don't know much about water. So we have a lot of water here, and it's almost as if we should reframe ourselves as the water state. And as many of you know, water is never far from sight. We are only second to Alaska in terms of miles of coastline, and Florida is known for its beaches, lakes, rivers, canals, springs. So these are water bodies that have captured our attention and that we flock to year-round. And while I currently live in Gainesville, I actually grew up in Broward County. And if the news wasn't reporting on an alligator in someone's pool, because it often was doing that, then it was often reporting on a torrential downpour in the afternoons or a pending hurricane. So water was literally everywhere, and it poured forth from the heavens. So for those of you who have been around for a while, and I'm only going to take us back to 2006 and 2008, but I would imagine many of you have stories that go way beyond that. But in 2006 through 2008, we were in the middle of a statewide drought. And this was a time when lakes literally dried up. So there were docks that extended to dry land or the occasional marshy pond, and it was these remnants of what was once a thriving lake. They stood like sad puddles. And in 2020, we experienced another drought-like situation as waterways were closed to the public because of COVID-19. So while the virus never took away our water, for those of us who rely on water as a form of recreation or sustenance, it sometimes distanced us from the water. And it wasn't that the water went away, right? So the water was still there, and it was precious in many respects and hidden from the public eye because it was beneath our feet in the Floridan Aquifer. And this is one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world. So if you're familiar with the springs, as many of you may be, the aquifer is this massive network of underground caves and waterways, and some of them are so big that a small car could fit through them. And it supplies the water for all of Florida. Now, here's another question for you all, although I am not going to allow Commissioner Lindsay to answer because I think he already knows the answer. So how many square miles would you say this system encompasses? And there's a hint on here that the entire state of Florida is roughly 58,000 square miles.
Go big or go home, 100,000.
100,000 over here. Any other thoughts? 80,000, okay. Anyone else? 40, okay. Does anyone want to take 60? Okay, we've got 60 in the back, okay. Those of you who chose 100,000, you were right. So according to the United States Geological Survey, the Floridan Aquifer encompasses 100,000 square miles. And those of you who might have chosen differently, although I feel like a lot of you are on the 100,000 square miles side, what it turns out, you might have asked, well, what about that hint that you gave us? The Floridan Aquifer extends into southern Alabama, southeast Georgia, southern South Carolina, while also covering all of Florida. So even when we're low on water, there's still tons of it around. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit because we kind of had a little bit of a discussion before about how cheap our water is, and recognizing that for a very long time we have just kind of been giving out these water permits like free candy kind of thing, right? But the important thing is that our water is very precious too. So the overabundance of water that we've seen in the years since the 2008 drought has supported tourism, industry, and our growing population that in 2014 caused Florida to surpass New York, becoming the third largest state in terms of population. And this, like I said, this overabundance has in many ways cheapened the price of water. It's given millions of people the ability to turn on the tap while also watering their deeply unsustainable lawns, right? So it's deceived us with the proclamation that there's an infinite supply to use for our pleasure, thereby cultivating a narrative that emphasizes use and sometimes abuse of water rather than how we interact with it and engage with it. So for the vast majority of Floridians, water is solely a commodity. And I say this because Professor Jean Menor, who specializes in Indigenous settler relations in Canada, contributed to a volume on the history of water. And in her chapter, Rivers as Text, she explores the shift in perspectives that accompany this, the development of land through a local mining community. So this shift in worldviews moves water from an organic view to a mechanistic view. And within this mechanistic view, we see that water has no value in terms except in terms of cash flow. So waters are not divine, they are not a means of creating and recreating life, they are commodities to be bought and sold water, and for that respect, nature cannot be allowed to run their course. Their integrity as natural systems are not represented. So other scholars have connected the dots, explaining that the economic uses of water correspond precisely to the rise in the political uses of water. Business interests, as always, were bound to politics, to governments who exploited new territories, and waters required to harvest resources are brought to global markets. Which sounds like a lot of jargon, but this is where we're kind of understanding that for a very long time we have shifted into this is a commodity to be used, and it's to be used for our pleasure, and it's to be used for our economic gain, which will only take us so far, right? And that's something that we're going to be thinking about. So this narrative, though, this idea of use and, like I had mentioned, abuse of water, it's existed since early European conquest. It's the same narrative that followed us through population and development surges that built canals and filled wetlands. And water was to be used, it wasn't to be revered, it was to be dominated, it was to be subdued, it was to be tamed, it was to be conquered. And increasingly, it was to be managed, right? And such a narrative, like I said, continues kind of to today. This was just from a few years ago, and our state welcome sign proclaimed that Florida was open for business. And while Florida can be open for business in many respects, if you take that language and if you look at it within the context of the environment, again, it perpetuates this understanding that the environment is another commodity to be used. So one of the other points that I would like to mention here, I'm going to shift slightly, is that water is fluid. So if contamination occurs, it's very difficult to clean up. In 2018, Environment Florida ranked our state as number 10 in the nation for industries violating the Clean Water Act, and they've cited fewer inspections of major industrial facilities and lax penalties. And these are companies that we know and that we often love and trust, right? And in a lot of cases, there are companies that we're employed by too. So Tropicana and Mosaic Fertilizer, Coca-Cola, Pilgrim's Pride, right? These are companies throughout our state. And given this information and the fact that we're talking about it within the context of the humanities, I want to challenge us to think about what it means to collectively reimagine our relationship with water, and really to tell a different story and to practice a different narrative. And this is where, like I said, I studied religion. Practice is a really important part of that, right? To practice what you preach, to practice what you believe, to practice your values. And more specifically, what happens when we listen to the spiritual motivations of people who are trying to advocate for these water bodies? And I'm asking here, can new stories help us to revise our interactions with water? And for this, I want to take you back to 2016, when South Florida experienced a series of extensive toxic algal blooms. And these wreaked havoc on waterways. They harmed marine life and severely damaged local livelihoods that relied heavily on the water. This is known as blue-green algae. The cyanobacteria outbreak caused lakes and canals to turn slime green, and it was accompanied by this overbearing stench. And it led state officials to declare a state of emergency in the summer of 2016. And by 2017, the blooms nearly covered Lake Okeechobee, Florida's largest lake. It led to fish kills and marine kills on both coasts, and the conditions continued to worsen. They eventually led to another state of emergency declaration by July 2018. And agitated by high nutrients, humans in the third largest state in the US both caused the problem, right, through industry and agriculture and storm runoff, as well as septic tanks and rampant development, but they were also impacted by the problem. So tourists and visitors kept their distance, which caused businesses to feel the brunt of that impact. And the sludge that brutally damaged local economies also presented a slew of respiratory problems for those who were living near the water. And it really caused Floridians to see just how interconnected they are with the natural world. And during this cyanobacteria outbreaks, environmental groups and forums on social media were faced with how to make sense of this problem in the midst of their work. And they had to really figure out how to best take action to clean up the water's most valuable resource. So while many groups ended up turning to petitions and protests, a handful of individuals turned to prayer and century-old ways of understanding their relationship to water. And one such collective began viewing the water's problems as a spiritual crisis. So they approached this problem publicly through prayer, ritual, and mindfulness. And this group was created in 2014, and they began, so this was before the outbreak, but they had been praying for the water for several years. And they did this through hosting sacred water ceremonies. And these consisted of rituals on beaches and banks of rivers. And holding such events in close proximity to other water bodies, they hoped to raise awareness about the sacredness of water while further connecting to water through positive energy forces in order to promote healing. So the group drew from the power of thoughts and actions in order to support restoration, both for the water and for the individual, through the creation of a clean and loving, peaceful planet for generations. And much of their message is rooted in the power of consciousness, and they professed that the words that you sent to water would either physically change water, like positively or negatively. And so while sending positive thoughts and compassionate prayers can help promote clean water. And now this is really controversial, right? Because it's pseudoscience. And it's in that realm of like, well, is this actually happening? After all, like, who deems what is positive and what is negative language? But what we need to investigate here is the broader story. And the fact of the matter is that proven or not, the idea of healing water, the idea of proclaiming the importance of energy, while whether or not it changes the water, it does show that it is more than something to be used. And so it's more than just a commodity. It's something that we actually need, right? It's something that actually enters our bodies. So the sacred water ceremonies, they draw from instruction and values, as well as knowledge and various cultures and a range of other earth-based belief systems in order to honor and bless the water. And this is the idea of promoting more of a holistic spiritual healing, right? They do this through song, prayer, reflection. They send these positive words to the water, and it's held within, like, very close to a water. So, like, this was held on Delray Beach, very close to, right on the beach, right? So right there on the Atlantic Ocean. Because I study religion, I'll give you a little bit more information about this. Prior to the start of these events, an altar is composed of sacred materials, often crystals or flowers, shells or stones. And this is established in the sand or on colorful blankets. And they're arranged in this circular or spiral pattern. It leads up to the center, and in the center is a vessel. Often people will take water from the local water source and they'll return it at the end. The interesting thing here that I think is quite striking is that they really ask people to listen deeply to the natural world. So leaders will highlight the songs of birds, the feel of the wind, the rush of the water. In some instances, participants are asked to put their hands in the sand or on the ground to connect themselves to the earth as similar living beings. And in between songs and acknowledgments of the natural world is a deep respect and care for water. Water is viewed as sacred. It's viewed as a source of life. It's viewed as the lifeblood of Mother Earth. So these positive vibrations, these positive words are weaved throughout the ceremony, and water is seen as an active agent with the capacity to record, store, and transmit information. And in this sense, water is viewed as an authoritative living entity. It's given the power to impact and transform the world in which it flows. And in this sense, participants gravitate toward the notion that Mother Earth cares for the human, plant, and animal life within her. And these ideas are not new. These ideas follow indigenous and Gaia-like notions of the earth as alive, or the earth as mother to all humanity and all life. And this falls within, thinking back to Professor Manor's quote that I had brought up, this falls within the realm of an organic outlook. So with these viewpoints, it's easy to see why ceremony leaders and participants alike draw parallels between the water and the human body. They recognize both the planet and humans are composed of similar percentages of water. And the ceremony emphasizes these connections, providing for a meditative silence or silent prayers as participants take a moment to remember their reliance on water for every living process. So apart from this ceremony, local indigenous leaders have hosted their own gatherings in which they draw from generational wisdom. In November of 2018, Healing Our Relationship with Water was a ceremony that was co-hosted by a Miccosukee grandmother and the co-founder of the Pachamama Alliance of Southwest Florida. And it was held on the dike of Lake Okeechobee just after a rainstorm. And they recognized the water in a feminine lens, and the ceremony looked to heal the relationships with water. And in this sense, water is viewed as a family member, and participants listen to the guidance offered by ancestors and the natural world in order to carry out these ceremonies. So nature guides them. And in 2018, various ceremonies have taken place, including since 2018, various ceremonies have taken place, including a handful of prayer walks, and 2 of these have circled Lake Okeechobee. And in this regard, prayers for the water have continued. So the prayer walks were actually about 7 days, I think, and they would walk in silence around the lake. They had gotten permission from everyone around, like all of the various stakeholders, landowners, communities, and it was a handful of people who circled the lake. So broadly speaking, these rituals, and more specifically the emphasis of water, express larger themes of connectivity. Leaders and participants view the environment as holistic, and they view humanity as one part of what constitutes the natural world. So in many ways, they are both within the natural world while also recognizing their disconnection from it, right? So identifying such disconnections allow participants to deepen the quest to establish closer ties with the water as they find it to impact every part of their life, including their own personal bodies. And a really interesting thing that I have come across while I was conducting interviews surrounding this, around the state with environmentalists who were working on water issues, is that they did see it connected to their bodies, right? And in some cases, people didn't have clean water, which impacted their bodies in various ways through illness and sicknesses and various things like that. So in this respect, lots of folks they don't necessarily just see the environment from an arm's length, but they see it within their own self and within a spiritual realm, and they're actively working toward a better tomorrow. And some of these folks are in constant conversation with water management districts. They're pushing for more effective policies, right? They're joining various consortiums, and they're joining various groups that are advocating for cleaner water. And again, it's the thing that they're doing here is revising and telling a broader narrative. And they're really just bridging the divide between Floridians and waters. They're reminding participants that they're one part of this natural world. They're reimagining the story and viewing themselves as part of the larger ecosystem in order to care for this larger ecosystem, right? So collectively, this view aims to turn the tide when it comes to understanding the once separate human-nature relationships, right? It bridges it. And these outlooks are not limited to the religious or spiritual realm. Environmental groups are, in other parts of the state, are also advocating for holistic understandings of nature and humans in order to change their relationship with water. And I will talk briefly about this because I also know, do you know what our time, do I still have? Okay, perfect, that's great. I just wanted to double check. So in 2019, a separate group of about a dozen environmentalists met in Orlando to rethink these human-water relationships. And many of them who showed up had dedicated their lives to springs issues. So they met here and they decided to create the Florida Rights of Nature movement. And this was with help from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. These activists joined the Global Rights of Nature movement, which secured legal rights for ecosystems, rivers, and non-human species around the US as well as abroad. And these are in places like Ecuador and New Zealand and India. These are places where local communities have said the laws that we have right now are not enough and we need to go a step further. We need to have rights for nature, for our ecosystems, for our water bodies. So in these cases, water bodies are more protected by law. Like I said, this follows a larger movement, and Florida environmentalists wanted their water sources to be viewed as more than just commodities for human use. They wanted them to be legally recognized, granting it the right to exist, flourish, and evolve. So about a half dozen groups working on various ways to incorporate local rights of nature embarked on petitions and meetings with lawmakers and county charters. And the environmentalists met a lot of resistance, but by 2020, they finally achieved victory when 89% of Orange County voters approved the Right to Clean Water Charter Amendment, making Orange County the largest jurisdiction in the nation to pass a rights of nature legislation. So the rights of nature movement is not necessarily spiritually or religiously driven. Such initiatives align with sacred water ceremonies, but they also reinforce this different narrative about human-nature interactions. One that shows way beyond the physical level to a deeper level, to how we understand ourselves. And there's a lot of questions that arise with this. Can water feel the energy that we're sending toward it? Does water actually heal and change through prayer? Will laws be a sufficient way of securing rights for nature? And if we grant legal rights to water, who is going to speak for the water? And these questions continue, and I can't answer any of this. But what I can say is that how we look and talk and think about water is changing, and these are transformative narratives. We have the potential to challenge this dominant larger system and really rethink how we approach the water crisis, right? By changing our relationship with this. And in Rick Kilsby's book, which is a fantastic book, if anybody ever gets a chance to check this out, he says, this is Florida's Healing Water. He says, if Florida's healing waters are to be healed, a paradigm shift needs to occur in the very way water is perceived. And this is recognizing human beings as part of the water cycle, and it's something that we've kind of missed along the way. And I will wrap up really quickly with this because I think this is an important part. For years, religion was very absent from Western modern medicine. And it's only been more recently that doctors have acknowledged the role that that mindful practices such as prayer and meditation and mindfulness really brings, not necessarily just to somebody's peace of mind, but really to how healing actually happens. Right? And so while it might seem far from the norm, people who engage in sacred water ceremonies and the rights of nature movement, they're also working in favor of environmental protection, and they're trying to shift the paradigm. So if we read beyond the surface here, if we really investigate these examples, we find that both groups are rethinking how we treat and interact with water. And the moral of this story is to think beyond ourselves, to think collectively about what water means to us, to you and to me and to the millions of others who call Florida home, and to the thousands who are coming each day and moving to Florida, because that's the reality of the situation, is that development continues to happen here. We continue to increase our population, and we only have a certain amount of water resources here, and it's important to be wise about it as we go forward. So whether it's saltwater intrusion or sea level rise or drought or red tide or cyanobacteria, given Florida's growing population and its finite resources, we're going to continue to experience strain. So these stories can help us to have a fresh outlook on this state and help us to collectively grapple with these climactic pressures. And I am going to end with this, because this is something one of my students wrote after a lecture, because I think it sums it up very well. I asked them to fill in the prompt, at first I thought this, and now I think this. And they said, at first I thought worshiping water was strange, and then I thought it isn't about literally worshiping water, it's about making water sacred and important in order to protect it. So in this sense, the role of narratives and how we view our relationship with water isn't limited to the religious or the spiritual or things that might seem a little outside or removed from us or removed from our comfort zones. Instead, it gives us a more holistic outlook for solving future problems. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I will turn it back over. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. For more information, go to polk-county.net.